Hi, I'm Katie Lee Coven. I'm the executive director for the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art. Oh, glad you made it. All right, let's get into our talk today. You'll hear from Danielle Stewart, who is our curator for exhibitions and head of academic programs. She was the curator of this exhibition, Women's Work, Recent Additions to the Collection, and it highlights work by women who we have acquired over the last 5 years. So the whole exhibition are works that we've acquired just recently, and it represents a broad stylistic range of women artists working over the last century. It consists of collage, photography, painting, printmaking, and sculpture, and explores women's self-expression and their contributions to the global art scene. And it includes work by local as well as international modern and contemporary artists. And again, just highlighting our efforts to diversify our collection. And she is joined today by a special guest, an artist, Jann Haworth, who is featured in the exhibition. Jann is a British American pop artist. She grew up in California in a home that prioritized art making. Her mother was a ceramicist, printmaker, and painter, and her father was an art director in Hollywood. And in 1961, at the age of 19, she decided to leave California and go to London. And she studied art history at the Courtauld Institute of Art and art at the Slade School of Fine Art. And there she quickly discovered that the environment for men and women was not equal, and started thinking about that relative to her work as she was experimenting with soft sculptures like Biscuit, which you'll probably hear more about today, which is featured in our exhibition. She's considered a pioneer of soft sculpture alongside Yayoi Kusama and Patty Mucha, and a leading figure in the burgeoning pop movement. She's most well known for the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band album that she co-designed with her then husband, pop artist Peter Blake. And she's won Grammys for that album cover. Do raise of hands, who knows the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts cover band album? Okay, some of you. All right. If you don't, I would recommend you do a quick Google so you have a reference point. It's one of the most iconic, literally iconic album covers in the history of music. So it's pretty, so check it out. If you don't know it, look it up, because it'll be an important reference, I think, in contextually as you hear more from Jann today, and things she's explored since that time. Her work is in major museum collections such as the Tate Britain and London, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, that's part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and of course, proudly, the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art. So, and last, before I turn it over to Jann, if you are down in Salt Lake City, you may stumble across some of Jann's large murals, which are inspired, and she'll, again, I think probably talk a bit more today about how they are an extension and an evolution from that Beatles album cover. One is at 250 South, 400 West. It's called the Salt Lake City SLC Pepper. And it's a huge mural, and it highlights a more diverse group of people than were featured on the original cover, album cover. And then there's one on the side of the Dinwiddie building that was commissioned by Zions Bank. And she co-created that with her daughter, Liberty Blake, and it depicts 250 of Utah's most influential and recognizable women. So if you're down in Salt Lake and you're driving by, and it may go, oh, I went to a talk with that artist. Now I know all about her. So I just wanted to mention that. You may not have, connected those dots before, but hopefully you will now. And with that, I want to turn it over. Please help me welcome Jann Haworth. She's going to speak a little about her work before we get into the conversation with Danielle. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm live now. I didn't dare turn around to see how many of you did or didn't know Sgt. Pepper. I'm really glad you don't, because it's in the past and music has moved on from that point. I sort of have a place in the world that has changed quite a lot. I grew up in Los Angeles, and my father was in the film industry, so I was very much imbued with that kind of experience of being on the back lots and on sound stages, and then in my mom's studio and eating clay and things like that. And then I went to London and had this amazing kind of transformative experience of living in Europe, and stayed for 35 years. And then in 1991, made a visit to Utah to see my father, who was living in Sundance at that time, and then just fell in love with the space and the light and the wonderful mountains and the snow and the seasons, and I could go on. You're very lucky to have grown up here. And in 1997, we moved here full time, and I started something called the Art Shack at the Sundance Resort that Libby, my daughter, and I ran, which was an art facility for the resort. And then we started a school, one of the first 6 charter schools in the state. And then we moved on to the Leonardo. Liberty and I ran the art department, art facility within the Leonardo Museum. So we've been in and out of education a lot. So it's a partner to what I do. And I guess I'm seen as a fine artist. I kind of don't necessarily get myself defined in my own head in any particular way, but and I've sort of been dragged kicking and screaming into the pop art movement, which I both abhor and celebrate. So we'll look at some of that today, and kind of talk about some of those things. So I have some slides to go through, and I will go through them very quickly. So it's really just to give you a quick glance into some of the things I've done, and probably not enough time for you to kind of formulate a big question. But if something comes up and you want me to stop a slide, please interrupt me. I really love interruptions. So anyway, let's go through these. This is a piece that I will dwell just a moment on. It's the first life-size figure I made in 1962. And behind her is a more recent work, one of the first works that I did in Utah. And so the kind of jump from the foreground figure to the background is kind of encapsulating, putting brackets around my time as an artist, if you like. So the old lady was something I wanted to look at age and change in women. And I had this notion that if you made a face that was a patchwork, that it would be sort of representative of the time of a woman's life. In other words, there's a wonderful quote by an anonymous quilt maker where she says, my whole life is sewn up in that quilt. There's a piece of my first baby's dress. There's a piece of my husband's waistcoat and my son's shirt. And I love that concept. And the idea was that her face told the story of her life. I thought of it as making old age very beautiful. And when I showed it, everybody said it looked like it came from Psycho. So I kind of struck out on my intention. But she endures, and she's in London now. And she's actually made on a chair. So it's a dressed chair, thinking of old age as, people turn into furniture. They're neglected, they're forgotten. They sit in a room, they sit in a corner, they don't walk as much. So there's a lot of things tied up in this particular piece. And it is true in my work that I return to various subjects. I return to donuts, to corsets, to invisible women, to old ladies. So every 10 years or so, I make another old lady. Old ladies today don't look like that anymore, but they did in 1962 a little bit. Behind her is a process that I developed where I paint large swaths of canvas, and then I do drawings that then become a pattern that I then sew together. And to do that with accuracy, really you can't make a mistake of a 1/16 of an inch. Otherwise, the whole canvas will ripple. So this build-up, it really started in the early 2000s, and I've been working this process ever since. So I now have double layer canvases and various things you'll see in a minute. This is just for your amusement. I did this figure. It is titled, he's wearing a badge that says, behind every successful man, there's an exhausted woman. And it's our friend Ben Norman. And he is a busker. And his mother saw something that was similar to this in, oh gosh, where was it? Vienna or someplace. So I wanted to make an old lady that was this kind of configuration. This is an old lady done about 6 years later, 5, 6 years later. She now is in the Modern Museum in National Gallery in Scotland. And you can move on to the next. Oh, her hands are sewn into the quilt, so she's becoming a part of the quilt. Donuts I've returned to a lot. This particular piece is owned by a museum in England. And it just occurred to me that it would be very funny to think of, you know, the different flavors of things. We have 31 flavors of ice cream and we have lots of flavors of donuts. What if you had a tapestry donut or a lace donut? What would be the flavor of that? And I just thought, it just cracked me up. I thought it was a really funny idea. And I thought, oh, I could just make lots of them and sell them, and then I wouldn't be such a poor student. And nobody wanted to buy them. I was going to sell them for, you know, like 50 cents. You know? Anyway, eventually they ended in a museum. So eventually it kind of came good. And then the cups at the back are willow pattern fabric that I found in a place in a store called, I think it was Selfridges. And I thought, again, you know, to make a soft teacup was just so funny, you know, that it kind of collapses on itself and sits down. And it just seemed a kind of rather ludicrous idea. This is called the art history of the 20th century. And I started it as an idea that I wanted to reflect on the idea that male art, turning male art into donuts. And again, I'm, you know, kind of having just fun, basically. But then I really wanted to do a donut to go with Merritt Oppenheim's fur teacup, because it was deeply absurd to make a fur donut. And then I saw Yoko Ono's piece where she and her husband were in a black bag and for a half an hour or something like that, and thought it was really, I have to tell you, I don't very much like that piece. But I thought it was funny. So you have to feel this bag, and it's kind of entwined donuts. But so there are two female pieces on this, but basically it's supposed to be about male art. And it's just, I would love somebody on an art history test to use this, where you have to name all the different periods of art. And I'll tell the professor what they are if that comes up. You can see what Cubism is, and kitchen sink down there, land art. Minimal art is right down the bottom of the corner, and it's a piece of transparent vinyl that's just the whole. So it's minimalist. Okay, next slide. And this is a more recent version. These are American classics. That's the key to the donuts. So they're things that where credit has not been given to the right person. It is not Disney who did Mickey Mouse. It's a man called Iwerks. And credit goes askew in all sorts of different ways. And I've both been a victim of that, and also, you know, feel it very strongly in terms of bringing out women's work, women's art, etc. And this is the biscuit that's just around the corner down there. And it was part of making food in cloth, which is funny, because if you think about it in your mouth, it's really horrid. And so this one, I love the idea that the British biscuits have little puncture marks in them. And I thought, oh, that representing that with a little shoelace thing. Katie called them, you call them grommets. Yeah, I don't know what I call them. And also the idea that you can use quilting to draw. So it's a drawing basically on felt. I just stuck this one in. This is a reference really to collaboration. This is a family piece that we were asked to do a piece for a charity in England that was going to give classes to children. And so we as a family did put it on a table and did a big donut as a collaborative piece. And I can tell you, it's really fun to do that, to have a big table covered with paper and to work up a piece as a group of people, just doing what comes to mind. You know, if you have a few pastels or something like that. Maybe not felt pens. Felt pens are kind of awful. But things like acrylic pens and things like that. It's a good project. And this is another vision of collaboration. I've done some stage design, 2 productions of Tommy, one here in Utah with Plan B Theater, and this was the t-shirt design for Tommy. This is a Utah charm bracelet. It's the one remaining of the different charm bracelets. I think all of them are in Utah in the Arts Council's collection, and UMFA and BYU. This is the Utah one, and it just is reflective charms. The point of these is that you can have something like a comic strip, but in 3 dimensions. And it also can be a narrative that's a personal portrait about time, things that you've done. So my first charm bracelets were reflective of my childhood, places I'd been. This is more contemporary and some of the things that have happened in Utah for me with, things I've visited or been involved in. And this is the first I wanted to show you of a series of corsets. These are double layered paintings, and they don't very much reproduce very well, because what happens is you can light them differently, so you can create different drop shadows and a different composition using lighting. And you also, the composition varies as you walk past it. So you're involved with making the composition happen. And it's a little bit like animation. So it's referential to film. Having said that, most of my work has some reference to film, either because of scale or because of it's a prop, or it's a substitute, it's a falsehood, it's faux, it's not the real thing. And all art could be said to be that, to be a kind of representation of something other than itself. And so I'm interested in that kind of double layer reference to film and so forth. I'm going to unpack that later if there are any film students here or anything. And this is reference to the Acid Queen's corset in the rock musical by The Who, Tommy. Music of that, by the way, is really good. And this is a Western one referencing Nudie Cohen, who was a Russian tailor who ended up in Hollywood and made cowboy clothes. I can't think of anything more oppositional than those 2 things. It's called Eat My Dust. And he and his wife were hitchhiking in Texas, and a big Cadillac went by them on a dirt road and didn't stop for them. And his wife turned to her husband and said, one day somebody's going to eat my dust. And they were very successful in California. And my first cowboy outfit was made by Nudie Cohen. These are more corsets, and these are bifurcations of gender. And double layer again. And you can see some of the drop shadow that you can use to draw on the back canvas. So there's about 2 inches between the front canvas and the back canvas. And I like that kind of palimpsest layering of work, that I can have things slightly hidden in the picture that you have to peep around to see. I've done some 4-layer paintings, and it's something I just really like playing with, that notion. This is Toon Scandal, and I did a lot of work with the idea of bringing Minnie Mouse forward. Mickey and Minnie weren't married, scandal, and she's pregnant, scandal, scandal. So, and I like the idea of a painting being a quote, and that it continues on. And that's again double layer. This is a recent work that I had a show in London. And I wanted to do things that were out of the rectangle. The exhibition's called Out of the Rectangle. And I wanted to go back to the idea of cloaks, which is another thing I've done quite a few of. And I had just done a big piece for Zion's Core building in Midvale. If you ever get a chance to go down to Zion's Core as a class or something, I would love you to see that mural, because I'm very proud of it. And it is referential to all the films that have been made in Utah and photography that's been done in Utah. So it has Ansel Adams, it has Dorothea Lange, it has Gertrude Kasebier, Carl Moon, and Edward Curtis, and then all the way up through to Sundance, including the Nalvani film that was made. And, so it's got some contemporary stuff one end. There are 5 canvases. And anyway, so the film strip idea has been something that's been in my work for quite a long time. And this one allowed me to kind of look at black and white classic film coming out of Hollywood. And it's a kind of pretend cloak. I don't know if you could actually wear it, but it's life size. Okay. And then this particular piece is another corset, but I wanted to have a piece of art that floated and that was flat, but that you could go around the back of it, and it was also another piece of art. And I'm particularly fond of this. It kind of puts a full stop on the end of the corsets, I think, for me. It's double life size, and again, kind of Utah color. Both Liberty, my daughter, who's out there somewhere, and I are advocates of a particular kind of paint. It's called Old Holland, and it's made of rock, and it really makes me feel that, you know, it's part of Utah. I don't know that any of the actual rock comes from Utah, but I think the idea of painting with rock is very elemental, and the color is not acrylic. I don't advise anybody to ever paint in acrylic paint. It's awful. But oil paint that is, you know, ground up rock, it has a vibrancy and a kind of textural quality, and when you put it on canvas, it makes this wonderful fabric that you can kind of do anything with. This is the first of the first 7 panels of the work in progress project that Liberty Blake, my daughter, where are you, Lib? Can you put your hand up? There she is. And I worked on, and Daisy, sitting next to her, also made one of the portraits on here. And it's the mural itself started as an idea that came out of a comic strip that I did. I realized I didn't know my history. I didn't know much about Rosalind Franklin. I didn't know, you know, really anything that was outside the art world or the literary world in terms of what women have done. And so I was horrified by that. And we managed to put together a project where we wanted to do a large mural that was a community project. So everything you see there, the front row is probably done by an artist, the front row figures, because doing a whole figure is kind of a challenge. But the other heads on this piece are done by people who may not have ever done art before. So 90% of the mural is done by people who were in workshops with Liberty and myself. And we taught them how to do a stencil portrait. So it's stenciled work on paper, which then Liberty collages into these 8-foot by 4-foot panels. The mural now has 22 panels, and it's just under 100-foot long. The most recent panels, which I have a slide of, that we did are now in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And it's an amazing project, those last final panels, for several reasons I'll unpack in a minute. But this was the first kind of run of it. And this particular mural, in its original form or in a vinyl repro form, has been to about 25 venues, you know, from New York to New Orleans to San Francisco, all over the place. And 2 of the panels were done here at USU, working with professors and a student from their department. And so there are 2 panels that you'll see that are USU panels. You can go to the next. The one on the left here is a USU panel, quite utterly gorgeous. TED one is one that we did with a TED Women Conference, and BYU is the other one. Okay, next one. And the one on the far right is the USU, and next to that is BYU. This is a mural that's in Salt Lake. If you go to Picture Line, their camera supply. If you're in Salt Lake, that one's just in the parking lot. It's Dennis Hopper, different periods of his life. And I was taking up the idea that time, if you reflect and reflect and reflect, it goes backwards. And so it's Dennis Hopper in his older years, and then in his heyday, and then he's holding a camera that has Dennis in when he's in high school. And then finally, there's a little half-inch one, little tiny camera that's an egg and a sperm. So kind of origins. This is the one I said I'd really love you to go see in Midvale. So this end is the photographic end. So it's Edward Curtis and Gertrude K. Spire and Ansel Adams, etc., and then going down. And it's patched together canvas. So in other words, the blue is painted blue canvas, and then that is natural canvas, etc. And then kind of big swaths of painting. This is just a quickie. This is another one that's on West Temple in Salt Lake City, and it's called Light Man. And this is the National Portrait Gallery one that Lib did. This is to reflect their collection, but to extend their collection. The mural all by itself ups the percentage of women in the National Portrait Gallery from something like 23% up to 41%. And it reflects on things that are works of art within the collection, but also people had the opportunity to choose someone they thought should be in the collection. So it expanded the collection to people that were either more contemporary or outsiders or unexpected people. And so the idea again is the same thing that we did workshops. 90% of it is non-artists. Front row is art professionals doing the full figures. And we managed to kind of slip in about 10 or 12 Utah artists into this. They had English names, so we kind of said they're English artists. So it was supposed to be all English centric. So, and this is Utah Women. This is 100 South near Maine, so near the Eccles Theater. If you happen to be going to the Eccles, you can see this. It's faded from this color level. It's been there since 2020, and it was to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of women's right to vote just before the 2020 elections. And we all know, don't we, that Utah has had the vote for 150 years, but the whole of the nation was celebrating the 100-year 1920 sort of establishment of women's voting rights. But Utah is a kind of outlier in that women had the rights in 50 years earlier than that, which is astonishing. So this is about 300 women, and Katie Lee Coven is on the mural, and this was made. It has its own story, this, and I could talk for hours about this, but I won't. It was made during the pandemic. So partway through, we did a few workshops, and then we were shut down. And so suddenly I was supposed to be going all around Utah doing workshops, and you couldn't. So I did everything by email. And so my day would start about 7:30 in the morning, getting emails in from, I don't know, Europe or something. And people all around the world were contributing to this because they were in lockdown, and they were with no materials. Some of them were not able to walk to an art store, so they did their stencil on the back of a cardboard cereal box or on wallpaper or something like that. And the thing was that it had this amazing journey for me, because I knew what it was like in Italy, that families were stuck in a village where people were dying, and the daughter couldn't get to that village. And in Belgium, other things were happening. They were restricted in a different way. In Edinburgh, they only could walk a mile, and then they had to go back to their house for exercise, that kind of thing. So the stories locked up in this are huge. And Logan certainly has a very important place in this, because right at the point of lockdown, right at the point that I should have said, we can't do this mural, I contacted Katie, and we talked through the workshops we'd done. And I said, could I have something that would allow us to get your mailing list, so I could actually contact people in Logan and do mural work with them. And we had a lot of response for that. So your area is very well represented in the mural.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that run through of your work. It was really fascinating to see that you've been through. I think that collaboration really comes through in your career, and beautiful the way that you've learned to kind of express your own ideas, but also to seek the help and the input of others. I think that sometimes art making can seem like a very isolating thing, but you've found ways to overcome that. I think that's amazing.
So ceramics I grew up with. I have a love of clay, and the fabric world for me, I didn't see really any reason why bronze sculpture should be superior to something made in fabric. It seemed to me arrogance and rather high mindedness to say that, oh, well, if you're going to be serious artists, you really should cast your work in bronze or something like that. Anyway, it'll last a long time. Well, who am I to say that my work should last a long time? I mean, if somebody really wants to keep it around, they'll take care of it. If they don't, yeah. So I think I think the thing about fabric for me is that the first piece I made were flowers, and I wanted them to be touched. I wanted them to be warm. I wanted them to yield. You know, I didn't want something that kept me out, that was hard and cold, like a bronze lily. I mean, that just seems sort of silly. So I think you know, it's about relationship, and I think it's true with Libby's work as well. That the first thing you want to do on these collages is run your hand down them, and you're not allowed to, which really bothers me. But you know, we do it anyway, don't we? Anyway, so yeah, I mean, the tactile is really important to me, and I think it again, it's kind of breaking the rules. So that's kind of what you do as an artist.
We're gonna have to pass the mic back and forth, but yes, I mean, I think that's one of the things that really struck me about your work is how warm it seems and how approachable. There's also this kind of uncanny quality, like you were talking about a little bit with, like the biscuit, where you think about what the texture would be of, you know, taking a bite of something made out of textile, right? That would be really kind of odd felt. Yes, yeah. And so I think there's also it's warm, but in some ways it's also very funny. And I love the role that humor plays in your work. I think sometimes we think about the arts as being very self-serious, you know, or very, you know, kind of high-minded, but I think that the humor that you bring to your works is really a revelation. And I wonder if you could elaborate more on that. How did you find that humor? Were you always just kind of a funny, happy-go-lucky person, or was did that humor, you know, come out of you realizing that the arts were kind of this self-serious place?
It makes me laugh. It doesn't always make other people laugh. I think that's the thing, you know, as I'm sort of chuckling away in my studio. And certain things just strike me as being kind of hilarious. And, you know, the donuts do. And I think that the other component of that is that it's also subversive. And we won't go into that, but it is. And, you know, it's that humor can be used in two different ways. I mean, some of you will be looking at Jon Stewart returning to the airwaves, and you know, the idea that humor takes something that's serious and lets you release something over that seriousness, and perhaps be able to greet it in a different way and say, okay, that I can manage. Now I need to do something about it. And that we're kind of in that place, aren't we, with climate change and all the rest of it. We go and see the movies about how terrible it all is, or what is happening, but do we do anything about it? And then as artists, you know, there's a job we have to be the canary in the coal mine, canary in the cage, whatever. You know, saying that we need to be actually action what we do, even if it's only in a small quarter of education, or you know, saying something that perhaps makes somebody wake a little to the disparity between women's representations in museums and in the art world. So it's, you know, each of us can nudge. We can't change. We can't save the world, but we can do a nudge. And that humor, subversive, big. You know, we didn't intend to be muralists, Lib and I. We've kind of it's happened, and I'm not even quite sure how. But this means that our murals are things that are seen by everybody. They're free. They're not locked inside a museum. They're for people. They're big. You can't avoid them, and it's sharing on absolutely rock ground level. It's not high-minded. It's actually art for free, art that can't be sold. It is made by a community, so it's subversive and it's also celebratory. And I think it's riding those double themes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your work it is so approachable in a way, and I love that about it, that it's something that can really connect, I think, with people. And it also occurs to me that part of, I think, the success of your work is that you bring this really broad range of experience, you know, coming from a California Hollywood background and then moving overseas, right? You've had to sort of navigate a wide world, and I wonder if you could talk at all about how that movement and the displacement and the kind of adapting to different places affected your work and affected you as an artist.
Well, I think yeah, I just speak to that. And for your experience, being in a place that isn't your home is a great upsetter. and it makes you redefine yourself. And also you're I don't know, you're remade. And I think for me, coming from the kind of educational background in California, which was, hey, you got your textbook, you learned everything you could in it, you took your test, and you went out the door with A or B or a C, depending on how well you did. When I went to London, it was as though the other half of my brain woke up. And it's getting both sides of your brain working that really makes you have power. And I think travel and displacement does that. It upsets you. And I think that it's really important, even if it's a gap year or study abroad or something like that, where you are thrown into a different culture, you're on, absolutely rock bottom because you don't know anybody, and you're electrified because there's so many different things coming your way. You're reborn basically because everything is new. And that whole experience, I think, of shift to as deep a degree as you can grab, do it, because it's absolutely formative. And I think that the intellectualism or the normal learning pattern that we have established, you need to kind of counter that with, can I make stuff up? Can I learn from looking? Can I live and learn? Um, you know, I think that's important, and you're right at that place. So,
Thank you. Yes, I know we only have a few more minutes left, but do we have any questions from the audience? If there are students with questions, I want to make sure that we get those for Jen. Let me just repeat the question so that we have it on the recording. But talk about your experience being kicking and screaming into pop, being dragged, kicking and screaming into pop.
I think David Hockney feels the same way, that he doesn't really feel he's part of the pop movement, et cetera, et cetera. When you're, as an artist, you don't, at the point you're making art, you don't say, I'm going to make a piece of pop art. The kind of labeling comes a little bit later in the whole episode. I always try to make something that hasn't existed before. I want something new and kind of, why do something that somebody else has done? So it's looking for a new trail, which is a big metaphor for me, by the way, because of Utah. But I think, kicking and screaming is just like, am I a pop artist? Do pop artists make old ladies? I don't think so. But then she is a figure in the world that's a contemporary world, et cetera, and kind of donuts are popular culture, if you like, and things. So I can see that the label applies. And certainly the artists of the time were having a lot of fun with things that were contemporary stuff, so you make something that is, what do you call it? Like a popsicle or something like that. And it's contemporary, but British pop art is very different than New York pop art. New York pop art is much more allied to advertising and business, as is New York. But I think the British pop art tradition, and it's worth looking at them kind of side by side and making this assessment, is much, it comes out of a fine art tradition, and it's much more sort of soft and painterly in a way. And it's quite interesting to look at that contrast, because I was much more in that than I was in a kind of New York mindset. Yeah, I would have kicked and screamed more in New York, I think, as a Californian. Yeah. How do I identify my work as not being labeled? Is that a correct Oh, I think Ivory Tower, I mean, I kind of, I do isolate myself anyway. And it's, I don't acquaint myself that well with contemporary what's going on. I'll glance across it, but rather like, I better not look at that. I better just know that, hey, that's going on. Don't want to duplicate anything like that. I don't know. I think most artists work independently, and in a way, if you said, hey, I'm a pop artist and now I'm going to do a Campbell soup tin, note the slight snide remark. Um, you know, I think it's kind of pathetic. It's like the art movement should be made of what the artists are inventing and exploring and making new stuff, and not kind of saying, oh, hey, I'm an abstract expressionist, so I can't do anything else. And I don't know if what I do now is pop art. I mean, I don't know if these murals would be considered pop art. I hope they're considered graffiti, and street art, that I hope they, the real graffiti artists would let us in a little bit. you know? Does that answer your question, or do you have a caveat? Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, it was an interesting process because in retrospect, those stories are told and retold, and it is very much about credit and where credit is due and who did what and all of that. And the creation of it was very simple. That the gallerist that both my then husband Peter Blake and I had didn't like the cover that had been put forward for the Sgt. Pepper album. He said it didn't fit the music. And he said, he asked Paul, he was good friends with Paul, as were we. We knew the Beatles kind of at that period of time. He said, why don't you ask Jann and Peter to have a look at it and see what they think? And so we went over to AMI, and they were laying down the tracks and things like that, and had a very brief conversation about the artwork. Didn't really say much about it negatively, just, hey, there it is. And then Paul came over to our studio to look at the work, and we literally talked for maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour, standing up, mostly in my space that I used as a studio, and really constructed the idea of the cover there. And it was a few minutes, and they were completely engaged in recording music. So we were left pretty much to our own devices, and it was built. So it was a fairly straightforward, hey this, hey that, and collaboratively done, and that's what we went with. There were a few outside things, like we hoped we would get permission from Madame Tussauds to use their figures for the front row, which we eventually did, but we didn't know that until the very last minute. So there were a few adventures within it, but it was a kind of 5-10 day project among other projects. So at the time, it was, hey, it's okay, we did that, now let's move on. So,
I think we're gonna need to wrap up, because I know some of the students need to head to class, and this classroom needs to be turned over in the next group. But thank you so much for participating, and thank you, Jann, for being here. It's such a treasure to have you here in Utah. I feel so privileged that of all the places that you've been, you've chosen to settle here, and we're glad to have your work in the museum. So yes, please check out the exhibit if you haven't seen it yet, and give a big round of applause to Jann.